In this lesson, we're learning about photosynthesis. We are still in Unit 1. We are in Topic 3. And our focus is very similar to that of cellular respiration. We're looking for inputs and outputs of different parts of the process of photosynthesis. So cells need to do work. We know that, we might be talking about chemical reactions, removing waste, bringing in nutrients, regardless of where that cell exists in an organism. Cells are doing these tasks. So to do work, you need energy, and we know that energy is found in organic compounds. We break it down in the mitochondria, and we can create ATP, which is our cellular energy, and we do that via cellular respiration. We know those kinds of things. We know that ATP has a high energy bond, so it's being broken down, and that energy is being released. That's how we get our energy. In organisms, organic compounds are turned into ATP, which then creates chemical energy converted into heat and kinetic energy. So this energy is transforming a lot. It's changing forms. Plants, however, use light energy to create chemical energy to help their own cells create ATP from this. So it's kind of feeding the cycle. We know that heterotrophs, that's us, we're just using other organic molecules to do this through cellular respiration, but autotrophs can actually produce it themselves. So we talk about this in terms of producers and consumers, which is one way of talking about heterotrophs and autotrophs, depending on maybe we're talking about a life cycle of something or in a food web. So photosynthesis is the process whereby carbon compounds are created in cells using light energy. So we're talking autotrophs once again, and the carbon compounds we're talking about are the ones we've already discussed, specifically carbohydrates, but we've also discussed proteins and lipids as well. So autotrophs are organisms that have the ability to make carbon requirements using this light energy and simple organic molecules that they've intaken. So essentially, this process is one big transformation of energy. It takes light energy, turns it into chemical energy, and therefore the organism can use it. If we look at our balanced chemical equation here, we can break photosynthesis down into its essential elements. There are 6 carbon dioxide molecules, 12 water molecules in the presence of sunlight and a photosynthetic pigment called chlorophyll, which is found in chloroplasts. It will create a molecule of glucose, just one. It's quite a complex, large structure, and 6 molecules of oxygen and 6 of water. So if we just take a little historical sidebar for a minute, prior to photosynthetic organisms, the atmosphere was almost entirely deprived of oxygen, right? We're talking very, very long time ago. And oxygen would previously be captured and stored in other ways. So photosynthesis is the most significant natural source of oxygen gas, and ancient prokaryotes, those really simple organisms, were probably absorbed into other organisms, and basically if they were a photosynthetic kind of prokaryote, then they have been taken on board via these new eukaryotes and used for their function. Okay, they were, not exploited. We wouldn't use that word at all. So photosynthesis is an active process, so it requires ATP. So it's this weird cycle. ATP is needed to have photosynthesis, which makes sugars, which are converted to get more ATP. So it's kind of a chicken and egg situation. Now the reaction requires energy to form bonds, meaning it's actually an endothermic. Okay, it takes energy in, it's an endothermic reaction. And because the reaction needs to bring in this energy to complete it, the light energy is filling this gap here. So light energy is doing a lot of heavy lifting as well. So that light energy is converted to chemical energy to complete that process because there's that energy deficit. So our main process is actually split into 2 parts. For natural growth scenarios, the light-dependent reaction will happen mainly during the day when sunlight's available, and then there's a light-independent stage, and this can happen at any time. We can see lots of different depictions of this process, and each stage is, again, incredibly complex. It's a big mix of chemical reactions within itself, and you can see that, part of the light-dependent stage actually involves what's known as the Calvin cycle, which is a very complex series of reactions, and essentially it results in carbon dioxide being formed into glucose. Just like cellular respiration, our goal is to look at the big picture as well as the 2 main stages here and worry about their location, their inputs and their outputs. Okay, that is what we are, thankfully, only focusing on. Overall, if we look at the process, it occurs in the chloroplasts, okay, which are those membrane-bound organelles in photosynthetic cells only. And chloroplasts have really interesting anatomy. Inside is a liquid solution called the stroma. It surrounds these stacks of flat, like coin-shaped discs called grana, and each individual disc is known as a thylakoid, and these contain chlorophyll, which are a pigment needed to convert that light energy into chemical energy. So overall, for this process, we're inputting carbon dioxide and water into the system in the presence of light and chlorophyll, and we're producing glucose and we're producing oxygen. All right, in the light-dependent stage, okay, the reaction is occurring inside that thylakoid when sunlight enters the cell and interacts with these proteins containing chlorophyll. So the photons from the sun, we need this sunlight. That's one of our inputs for a start. The photons from the sun excite electrons in this chlorophyll, which splits water, okay, into hydrogen and into oxygen during this process. Now we've got these hydrogen carriers just like in cellular respiration, so that's where the hydrogen goes. The oxygen is used in aerobic respiration, so it's going straight into the other cycle, or it can be released into the atmosphere. Hooray, we can breathe it in. The hydrogen is going to be picked up by those hydrogen carriers, and they all move to the thylakoid membrane. And they build up in concentration and allow ADP to turn into ATP. So we are actually producing some ATP in this process as well. Now, in the light-independent reaction, it's also known as the Calvin cycle. This is occurring in the stroma, okay, a different part of the liquid part, essentially, around all those thylakoids, but it's still in the chloroplast. So we are talking products of the light-dependent reaction are going to come in, start as our inputs in the next stage, and they're transported to that stroma. Enzymes are breaking down carbon dioxide, they're mixing these with these hydrogen atoms, and we're forming that glucose, right? That very complex molecule. Oxygen is also produced, and the ATP provides this required energy to power these anabolic reactions, and eventually will be broken down into ADP. Because it's been spent essentially. So one glucose molecule is made for every 6 carbon dioxide molecules that come into this system, and 6 water molecules as well. And glucose and oxygen are the products of the reaction, and then they're used to create ATP in the cellular respiration. Okay, so there's that chicken and egg. So like any kind of chemical reaction, there are factors that will impact how fast and efficiently this photosynthesis is going to occur. So generally the factor that is furthest away from being ideal is going to be the limiting factor and slow down the process. Temperature impacts photosynthesis because, like every other chemical reaction we've talked about, it's controlled by enzymes, and we have to keep the enzymes happy, so they need to be working in their ideal conditions. If it's too high, they're going to denature. If it's too low, there isn't enough kinetic energy for them to collide with their substrates. Light intensity is obviously going to impact photosynthesis in that light-dependent reaction, in particular that photolysis of the water and the ATP creation at the beginning, but eventually it'll become saturated and will kind of max out, so it can only absorb so much light anyway. If the concentration of CO2 is going to change, it's the substrate concentration, it's the substrate we need in the light-independent reaction, and again, controlled by enzymes, so the enzyme rules apply, so the more substrate we get, the more we can actually do, and then eventually it will plateau out. So one limiting factor is the type of light energy that the organism can absorb. And visible light spectrum available to plants and photosynthetic organisms is usually around 400 to 700 nanometers. So red is that lowest energy and blue is that highest in that visible light spectrum. So white light is a mix of all the colors available. Things appear certain colors because they reflect certain colored light. So chlorophyll is that green thing, that green pigment found in plants. And because it is green, it is reflecting green, which means it is absorbing blue and red. So they are the best things to be absorbed during that light dependent stage. There are many kinds of photosynthetic pigments. It's not just chlorophyll. And we can, separate out all of these kinds of different light waves and figure out which kinds of plants and which kinds of pigments can absorb the best. Essentially, each type of pigment has a really specific type of light wavelength that will, absorb best. And we can see from this absorption spectrum that none of them really absorb green light at all, because that's what's being reflected back, which is why those plants look green. So our focus here, inputs, outputs, and locations of those stages, but having a general understanding of photosynthesis is also really good.